I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. I had the opportunity to see the presentation that you are about to see right when I was coming out of my creationist belief system. You know, I had become kind of a dormant in the faith believer. I first was a hardcore creationist, and I was like, I don't know, and then I don't really buy it, and then wait a minute, let's discover what this evolution thing is. Previously, I'd only been taught the caricature of evolution, right? The stuff they teach you from the podium, you know, from goo to the zoo to you, and then they'd laugh out loud, you know. Picture of Darwin's face on top of a monkey. That was how I had been raised to see evolution. And so here I am, a freshly emerged and slightly rattled atheist, and I want to discover more about what evolutionary biology is. And so I stumble upon this speech online by Dr. Donald Prothero. No idea who he is. And I saw such wonderful information that I could not wait for the opportunity to bring cameras and shoot the material again for a wider audience, to sort of frame it and format it in a way where it will be palatable to the largest, broadest audience out there, people who may not normally engage in these types of discussions. Dr. Prothero is an American paleontologist and geologist. He is an educator, currently a research associate in vertebrate paleontology at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. He's written over 300 scientific papers. He has written more than 30 books, including his brand new one just released a couple of months ago. I brought this to have it autographed. The Story of Life in 25 Fossils, Tales of Intrepid Fossil Hunters and the Wonder of Evolution. And this just came out recently. I highly recommend it. I'm just into it, but so far I highly recommend it. He is tomorrow going to be accepting an award, the second highest award in his field. It's the Joseph T. Gregory Award for Service to Paleontology, an extremely high honor. And of course, we are honored to have him join us tonight to give his presentation. Please welcome Dr. Donald Prothero.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you guys all coming out. This is sort of interesting. I actually did this presentation, as Seth mentioned, about 10 years ago for the Skeptic Society in Pasadena. And it was filmed at that time and then put on YouTube eventually. And it led me to write the book, which some of you have seen, Evolution, What the Fossils Say and Why It Matters. And then I found myself giving talks and talks and talks based on the book, which had been based on the original talk. And now I find myself doing it again 10 years later. And of course, I've learned a few things in 10 years, as we all should be learning. So there'll be a lot of changes from what you might have seen if you look at the older version of this. Stuff that's out of date, like there's no reason ever anymore to talk about intelligent design. That's extinct since the 2005 Dover decision. And stuff that's new, new fossils and new ideas. So there's going to be quite a bit of stuff here. So even if you know my 10 years ago version of this, you'll find stuff that you have not seen before. And as I said, it started with this book, which was actually based on the original talk from 10 years ago. And I've just been told by my publisher this afternoon that he will do a new edition of it, and it'll be in paperback. So it should be out maybe in a year or so. As Seth mentioned, this book here, The Story of Life in 25 Fossils, is one that I just got out this last couple of months. So that's one I'm out now plugging at this moment. And I always start this talk with something that's always the central in the mind of most people who will watch it. It's just this notion they've been fed, typically by their own churches, that somehow you have to be an atheist if you accept evolution. And of course, that's patently false. The majority of religious people in the world accept evolution and are not atheists. Okay? And not only that, but in this country, nearly all the mainstream Protestant groups, except the most fundamentalist, accept evolution. Okay? The entire Catholic Church is good with it, of course, especially the current Pope. All but the most conservative Jewish groups accept evolution. So it's very much not the case that you have to be an atheist to accept evolution. This is something they use to drive a wedge between their group and the rest of the scientific world. If you doubt me, you can Google the string Clergy Letter Project. And I think it's now close to 15 or 16,000 rabbis, priests, and ministers, all of whom accept evolution, have signed on to that website. And it keeps growing all the time. And then if there's many of my colleagues in paleontology, evolutionary biology, are quite religious, a variety of Catholics and different kinds of Protestants and Jews as well. and find no problem with it. Some very prominent ones, including Francis Collins, who's the head of the National Institutes of Health, is very Christian, as is Peter Dodson, a very famous paleontologist, and Daryl Domning. I can list a bunch of them, but the point being that they have no problem with the religion as they see it. So it's not something that precludes your beliefs in that regard. And when my good friend and former mentor, Stephen Jay Gould, said, it's really two non-overlapping ways of looking at the world. Science does not deal with the kinds of supernatural questions that religion is formed to do with, and theoretically religion shouldn't mess with scientific issues, although that doesn't always work out that way. If we don't doubt me on this, one of the previous popes, John Paul II, said, the Bible tells you how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go, which is actually a paraphrase of Galileo. So that's very important, because usually the first stumbling block is that people say, well, I must surrender my faith in order to accept science. And that's a false choice. But a lot of churches make you do that in order to stick with their way of doing it. And I put this slide up here, even though this is an ancient thing, and Time magazine probably no longer existing by the time this comes out. But yes, evolution is always under attack in this country. It hasn't really stopped in about a century, even though that's an old slide. And it's funny because it's gone back and forth in sort of waves. When evolution was first proposed in 1859, of course, it was hugely controversial, especially in England where it started. But by the time Darwin died in 1882, it was not controversial among any educated person in Britain, except for a few old guard who hadn't died yet, and most of Western Europe, and pretty much not so much in this country either. In fact, even in the early part of the last century, and in 1901 or so, even Christian ministers in the South accepted evolution. Okay? It wasn't that big a deal. It was really not till the 1920s, when there was a fundamentalist backlash and a conservative movement in general, the so-called age of normalcy right after World War I, that they had the same movement in mostly the southern states to attack evolution. And that's when it suddenly became a central point of their belief. About the same time, fundamentalism actually arose. Fundamentalism hasn't always been a part of the American landscape. It's a relatively late movement, only about 100 years old. And it was, again, a backlash against the modern world that was coming around the turn of the last century. And that was led to the famous Scopes monkey trial in 1925, which legally was a complete wash, because the trial was a mistrial and never was appealed, and the laws was never taken off the books immediately. But what it did do is have a chilling effect on American science education. So evolution vanished from the textbooks, even though legally it was not a problem to teach it in most states. And was stayed out of the textbooks and out of American education till Sputnik was flying overhead in 1957. And that all of a sudden woke up Americans to realizing that they had let science get behind the Soviets, as they were then. And so that led to a huge movement in all the sciences, including biological sciences, to update their educational process, which then, because it's all back and forth, it stimulated a huge backlash among the creationists and fundamentalists. And that's when the modern creation science movement really came to be. It was a backlash against science education being updated in the early 60s. Okay, so these are all waves of things going on. And the history since then, just on very brief terms, each time the fundamentalists try to push their agenda, they run up against the wall, the First Amendment of the Constitution, and the separation of church and state. And so initially, of course, they just tried to openly deny evolution, as the Scopes trial was based on a law, the Butler Act in Tennessee, which forbade the teaching of evolution. In the 60s, they couldn't do something quite so obvious. They tried to get creation science, they called it, which is a contradiction in terms, taught side by side with evolution. And of course, the Supreme Court struck that down. And then they tried another version of it, and they took the references to God out of it, and the Supreme Court struck that down. And then they tried the latest movement, which was back in the 90s and the early part of this last decade, which was the so-called intelligent design creationism, where they didn't specify who the designer was, but we all know who their real idea of that person was. And that was finally shot down in 2005, and that movement's effectively dead, although at the time I gave this talk 10 years ago, it was still active. So that's disappeared from the agenda. As we'll talk about at the end here, what they now do is a more subtle strategy of working on local school boards and doing things like teach the controversy, teach both sides of an argument. Well, we don't teach both sides of whether the earth is flat or round, but that's the kind of thing that you're dealing with here. Okay? Oh yeah, this slide is a little hard to see here, but it's basically here the minister of fundamentalists is saying, see, they are equal weight and they should have equal footing in the classroom, the weight of all of science, and he's of course pushing hard on the scales of creationism. So what I will focus on in this talk is the area I know the best. I've been a paleontologist for more than 40 years, and most of the specimens and many of the things I've talked about in this talk I've either personally worked with and in many cases published myself, so I speak from firsthand experience. I give personal testimony, which is a valuable thing in this community we talk about. It's not something that I'm just reading in a book. And that's valuable too, because a lot of times that's the problem. And especially because what stimulated this whole thing to begin with was years and years of battling creationists who had never in their life seen a real fossil and could not tell one bone from another, and were pretending to talk about fossils, and they couldn't even tell if the slide was upside down or right side up or not. Okay? And that was something very frustrating. I debated their main guy, Dwayne Gish, in 1983, and I've debated quite a few of the other ones. And again, it was obvious to me they're just reading from a script. They would have no idea what their slides actually show because they have no first-hand experience. And yet, it's very common in the creationist community to pretend that they are paleontologists, to pretend that they know what they're doing. But the problem is, if you look close enough, you recognize they'll say, oh, we have so many PhDs in support of creationism. But it doesn't, by itself, mean a PhD shows you're effectively a paleontologist. A PhD just shows you know how to jump through a lot of academic hoops and stick to the problem long enough. And what I often say to people is that a PhD actually makes you narrower than when you start out, because you have to specialize to the level that you can finish a specific project, and you may actually become less smart at the end. But they, of course, try to cow their listeners by saying, I'm a PhD, I'm an expert in everything. Okay, and that's a false argument right there. That's a false use of argument of authority, because they have no direct experience. Dwayne Gish had been in science since the late 1950s, and he was a biochemist. He knew nothing about fossils. Henry Morris, who was the other founder of ICR, was a hydraulic engineer. Right? None of these guys actually work with fossils, so they're not qualified to do this stuff. Yet they would always flaunt their PhDs on their book covers and everywhere they go, and they would suitably cow their audience. And I always say to people, you know, the PhD is only relevant if your training is in the field that you're talking about. And if you have no first-hand training and experience, you might as well be doing something else. And so you wouldn't say if a guy has a PhD doesn't mean he can fix your car or write a symphony. So why should he be qualified to talk about fossils if he doesn't have a PhD in paleontology? So that's something to be careful. It's called credential mongering. And it's a very common trait of pseudoscience, especially anyone who puts PhD on the cover of their book. Usually it means the arguments inside can't be supported by themselves. All right? So, for example, there are books like this that Dwayne Gish published, Evolution, the Fossils Say No, which the book I did in 2007 is almost a direct answer, almost page by page to his. And then the more recent version, like of Pandas and People, which was the one that was used in the Dover trial, which is part of the intelligent design argument. Okay, I won't put these lists up very, very long. Just to talk about the common misconceptions that almost everybody has. You know, not just creationists, but most Americans have, because their science education has not been very good, sometimes due to the fact creationists have ruined the science education process. And the first and most common problem we have is people have a completely erroneous notion of how evolution works. And this is a notion that actually goes back to before Darwin and was immediately invalid the moment the Origin of Species came out in 1859. This goes back actually to Aristotle. This idea of the scala naturae, or ladder of nature, or the great chain of being is another metaphor from the 18th and 17th centuries. Okay? This idea that it's from protozoan to sponge to mollusk to reptile to birds to us. Now that's a notion that goes back a long time. It's very deeply entrenched in theology. And in some of these versions you can see cherubim and seraphim and angels and archangels, and then all the way up to the deities at the top. But that has nothing to do with science or biology, because evolution is not a ladder. Evolution is a branching, bushy sequence. Okay? Ancestors give rise to descendants, and usually they're living side by side. Okay? And then they're speciate and have more and more branches, and some die out and some persist. But it is not automatic that you march up a ladder from a sponge to a fish to you. And yet that is the metaphor, that is the visual icon that nearly all Americans hold about evolution. And so you get all sorts of weird ideas here. For example, this is a famous BC cartoon by Johnny Hart here where the two cavemen are talking, and it said, if man is descended from an ape, how come apes are still around? And his partner says, because apes had choices. Okay? Or if God made Adam from dirt, why is there still dirt? It's a completely false notion. All right, and then whenever I hear this, they say, oh, the apes are still around. If humans evolved from apes, why are they still around? I always want to heat my head against the wall, because it's a fundamentally false idea about the world. It's comparable to saying, if you're descended from your father, why is your father still around? Right? In both cases, unless your father immediately died the moment you're born, you coexisted in time. Right? You don't automatically replace the other. Okay? And in many cases, you overlap with your grandfather, too. Right? They don't automatically die just because you're born. And that's why it's a bush, right? You branch out from your parental lineage, not a ladder. Okay. So the problem they have is that with this thinking that life is a ladder comes from a lot of the older notions about evolution. And you see old diagrams like this one here, the evolution of horse through time. That's from 1925. It's 90 years old. Okay? It was as good as we had then because we had very few fossil horses. But what we now have is a very bushy, branching pattern of horse evolution. One that has many, many species which coexist in time. And there's some places, for example, in western Nebraska where there are 15 different species of horse in the same hole in the ground. Okay? It's not just a simple linear march through time, one horse to the next. And this is an improvement, right? This is more information over the last 90 years now that we have been able to obtain that shows us how much more complex horse evolution was than we thought 90 years ago. But you'll have creationist books saying, oh, well, they changed their story. Well, of course we did. We got more data. That's what science is supposed to do, okay? And very typical, of course, of the problem is that when you see diagrams like this is virtually the icon of how evolution is portrayed in almost all media, but especially in print media. And you have various human lineages marching through time with whole sorts of variations thereof. So here's a creationist saying the Earth is only 10,000 years, somewhere between Homo erectus and Neanderthal. Or here it is, humans going to the advanced form and then descending to a stoop-shouldered person on a computer. I also have one, I couldn't find the slide, where it descends into Rambo at that point. And that icon is just everywhere. And it's totally wrong. Right? This is the way most of the public understands evolution, so much so that this is the way it's represented in a single image, except it's completely wrong and has been wrong since 1859. Human evolution is not a march up from cavemen to us. It's many, many, many different species. Right? There's something like 20 different species of hominids now known. One was just described a few weeks ago, the Homo solidi from South Africa. Right? It happens almost every other year that another species gets described. Okay. A second very common misconception that you have in creationist literature, which again comes from the general public's misunderstanding of how science works and how geology works in particular, is that, of course, the fossil record does show change through time. And creationists who want to believe in Noah's flood have to figure out some way around that. And there's two versions I take of it. One is to say, oh, well, the geologists arranged the fossils to prove evolution, and then they point at the fossil record and say, ah, it proves evolution. Like we seeded it so that we'd have a case in our effect. Well, I'll show you that one right away here. That is actually a historical lie because the people who figured out that the fossil record changed through time were creationists. Way back in 1820, at least 30 years before Darwin's book came out. Okay? They were all devout, mostly Church of England believers. None of them questioned the Bible in any way at that time, but they knew the fossil record showed change through time. There was no evolution in the picture at all at that point. Okay? The other version, which comes from the people like Henry Morris and the people in the Institute of Creation Research, is to try to claim, well, Noah's floods, the hydraulic had sorted them, or the smart animals, ran to higher ground before they were drowned. Okay, variations of that theme. That's where modern flood geology tries to claim and has since about the 1960s, actually. And that, of course, any real geologist looks at that and they shake their head. How the hell did they get that notion? Okay, because what are they doing? They're actually trying to explain a diagram from a kiddie book. Not the real fossil record. Okay? The real fossil record is not a kiddie book diagram. It's actually very complex, which is why kiddie book diagrams are simple. But you don't try to explain something that's an abstraction from a kiddie book. Okay? But that's what they're doing. Like there's nothing on the higher levels that's as advanced as the lower levels. No, that's just a simplification. And that's what they're explaining, not a real rock record. Now there are places where you can see the continuous sequence of the rock record and the fossils that are found in it. You can go, for example, to the Grand Canyon and find the sequences of what we call Paleozoic beds from the Cambrian to Permian. So that's from about 550 to 250 million years ago. And then you follow that last bed north until you come to the base of the rocks at Zion Canyon. You follow that all the way up to the top. And then you pick up the sequence up by Bryce National Park and you get to red beds that are all the way to the Oligocene, about 20 million years old. So whether that sequence is real, and there are places on the planet where you can actually follow it all the way to the top pretty much. So it's not something we made up, right? It's actually observable if you wish to go look at it. But it also doesn't fit their preconceptions, okay? For example, you can go in the Central Rocky Mountains at Dinosaur National Monument and look at huge bone beds of Jurassic dinosaurs, which presumably could hike up to higher ground when it got flooded, except that right above it are marine beds with giant clams and nautilus relatives and things like that, which supposedly should have been in the lower strata. And then right above that are Eocene mammals, which are sitting somehow on top of the dinosaurs, which actually should have been able to step on them on their way to the high ground. And then on top of that are more fish, right? That's a real fossil record. It's complex. It's not a cartoon of primitive to complex. Or the area I did my dissertation work in, the Big Badlands of South Dakota. You have a real sequence of fossil mammals here from the bottom to the top, and some of the biggest ones are at the bottom layers, and then right above them are the turtles. In fact, the most common animals in this layer right here are land tortoises. So we have a version of the tortoise and the hare where apparently the tortoise could outrun even the biggest land mammals, if you believe flood geology. Okay? So I put this new cartoon in here. I just saw this. And so Noah's telling his sons, go out and bury all this mess, and don't forget to put in the proper order. Ediacara near the very bottom, then trilobites, then dinosaurs, and finally the mammals. But Dad, it's going to take us like millions of years. So the Noah's flood model is based on wishful thinking, right? No first-hand familiarity with the real record. The flood idea is full of holes for lots of reasons, and the first of which, of course, it does not explain the actual fossil record. It explains a cartoon. A third common thing you find all the time in the creationist literature, and even in recent creationist literature, like the book Darwin's Doubt by Stephen Meyer, who's one of the ID creationist group, is an attempt to claim that the beginning of the Cambrian, which is the earliest period for which we see complicated multicellular animals, is some sort of an unexplained mystery that cannot be resolved by science, okay? And they talk about in Darwin's time, of course, when almost nothing was known of fossils earlier than the trilobites, so it was a big mystery in 1959, but we've made a little bit of progress since 1859, yet you never know it from the creationist literature. They keep citing really outdated stuff from the 1940s and earlier, when almost nothing was known about this interval, and a gigantic amount of information has been found basically since the 1940s. We have all sorts of transitional fossils now that show how we go from single-celled life all the way to trilobites and eventually other things. Yet nothing in the creationist literature ever reflects this. Even the recent book by Meyer, as I mentioned, Darwin's Doubt, completely ignores the most crucial evidence of all because, of course, it's inconvenient to his argument. And so, for example, you see not just the creationist literature, but even Time magazine saying, you know, evolution's Big Bang, talking about amazingly fast. 25 million years is not fast by most people's standards. But Time magazine, of course, is trying to sell magazines, so that's how they do it. And I'll just give you a quick run through of why we say, you know, if anything, I don't want to use the term Cambrian explosion anymore, because it isn't an explosion. We have all the steps now, going all the way back to 3.5 billion years ago in both South Africa and also Australia, the first fossils of anything single-celled. These are blue-green bacteria that look very much like their living relatives. They're still around today. And they formed the only megascopic structures we see from that time, which are these big sort of mound-like structures formed by mats of these bacteria, which trap sediment. That's the only fossils that are visible to the naked eye for 80% of life's history. Okay? That's a real deflator to the human ego. 80 to 85% of life's history, nothing more complicated than single cells. Right? From 3.5 billion to 500 million years ago, we weren't in the picture at all, of course. And not only that, it's just this. This is the most complicated form of life on the planet. My friend Bill Shopp at UCLA calls it planet of the scum. Okay? And that's really what it was. I mean, if an alien had visited this planet, odds are this is all they'd see, and they probably left. All right? And then about 700 million years ago, we start getting these multicellular soft-bodied creatures that sort of resemble jellyfish and some kinds of worms, most of which we're really not sure what they are, but they're big. Some of them are this big across. And they left impressions in a bunch of localities, starting with the Ediacara locality in Australia, but all over the world now. And so those are well known. So we're going from single-celled to multicelled, but not with a skeleton or shell of any kind. Okay? And the very first stage of the Cambrian, that's the first two stages of the Cambrian, we don't get trilobites yet or anything big. What we get are these little tiny things. These are mostly about the size of a pinhead, the size of a grain of sand. And they're little tiny elements in the armor of some of these very primitive things, some of them which may be actually very primitive mollusks. But they're really tiny, and that's why they're missed for so long. We call them the little shellies or the small shellies. And this is the group that tells us now we're starting to see shells for the first time, but naturally shells start small. It's a big biochemical leap to start crystallizing things in your tissues to make a shell. And only into the third stage of the Cambrian. So there's the first two stages where there are no little shellies and no trilobites. Here's the third stage where the supposed explosion takes place. There's already been 25 million years of evolution before the first trilobite. Okay? And 3 billion years of evolution since the first life was found. Okay? Not an explosion by anybody's stretch of imagination. In my books now I say stop using explosion, call it Cambrian slow fuse if you must give it a label, but you're misleading the audience. It's just because geologists, something 600 million years ago that took 20 million years looks fast. But we are used to million-year time frames, which most people don't think in, okay? But Stephen Meyer in his book, for example, completely ignores the existence of this entire first two stages of the Cambrian, right? Because they would falsify his entire book if he mentioned them, which of course he does not, okay? So the rest of this lecture, however, I'm going to focus on what is often the key dispute when you argue with creationists about fossils, that they always have to find some way to discredit the fossil record that shows evolution, especially what are called transitional forms or transitional fossils. The old metaphor of missing link now is a bad idea. Missing link is back from the chain of being, which is an invalid idea to begin with, so I don't say missing link, though the public knows that term, and unfortunately reporters know that term, which I have to tell them not to use it. Particularly the fossils that show how we get from one group of animals to the next, the transitions. And they aren't as common as we'd like, but then fossilization is a very rare process. Maybe 1 in a million types of species has ever been fossilized. So our odds are very bad, and yet a remarkable number of these things have shown up. And that's what I'll focus on for the rest of this lecture. Going all the way from the simplest life. These are the kind of things I did when I was a graduate student, working on single-cell amoeba-like creatures, which have simple bubble-like shells, show amazing changes in these shells over very, very long periods of time. And I remember when I used to work on deep-sea cores as a graduate student, you could literally see every stage of this as you sample your way up the core. Nothing's missing. The whole sequence of transformation from something shaped like a big sponge all the way to these funny things that have all sorts of caps and spines on them. And you can see every one of the intermediate forms in that entire sequence, okay? Or things that are familiar to most of us who collect fossils, from trilobites to mollusks like this are actually from the Texas Gulf coastal plain to horseshoe crabs. There's lots and lots of evolutionary sequences. You show these to an average creationist and they yawn because they're not vertebrates, right? They're not interested. So let's talk about something else. The sand dollars, we can show how they evolved from sea urchins. But they usually ask, well, what do you do in the way of fossils that show the transition between the major groups? Sometimes they call these created kinds. Sometimes they're not very consistent. The various, what biologists would call their various phyla of animals, like mollusks and echinoderms and so on, are phyla. Well, we have quite a few of those, despite the fact that's not an easy thing to find. This is the famous example that was found in the 1950s in a deep-sea trench off Costa Rica. This is a very, very primitive mollusk. It has a shell shaped sort of like a limpet. But if you look at the underside of it, it's unlike any other mollusk you see on the planet today. It still has segmented gills, segmented muscles, and all the things that no other living mollusk has because the nearest relative mollusks are segmented worms. Okay, so it's sort of halfway to mollusk, halfway to worm. Okay, or how about something that's a transition between the jointed-legged animals like insects and spiders and scorpions and crustaceans, the arthropods. We have these soft-bodied creatures called onychophorans, or peripatus right here in the slide. These guys are sort of halfway between a sort of caterpillar-like form, but they also look quite worm-like. They also shed their skins. The only other group that does that is insects and their relatives, plus a couple other obscure groups. So they're very close relatives, but they look very worm-like to most people. Again, not vertebrates. So what do we do about vertebrates? Well, even here we have an amazing sequence of our closest relatives, which, believe it or not, among all the animals not related to us closely, the closest is sea stars and sea urchins and things like that. Those are actually our closest relatives, the echinoderms. And we can see in the fossil record how we make that transition from them to these very primitive relatives of the chordates, which are very primitive fish-like creatures, starting with things like these what are called tunicates, which are these things that look hardly like anything you can imagine. This little blob of jelly that has a filter basket. But they have characteristics of the most primitive fish in them, including a gill arch and all the rest. Pharynx is something you and I also have. And then to things like the lancelet or branchiostoma, which is the amphioxus is another name for it, which is very fish-like but doesn't yet have a full mouth and a lot of other things that we associate with being a vertebrate. Okay? And then only about 10, 15 years ago then, they started finding these amazing soft-bodied fish in China from the late Cambrian, early Cambrian, which don't have any bone yet, but they're beautifully preserved. And they're clearly much more advanced than anything that we've seen prior to that. So we start to see the evolution of our lineage, the chordates and the first fish. And when you put them all together in a diagram like this, you can see where do you draw the line? Okay, here's something everyone agrees is a fish. Here's something everyone agrees is a worm. Yet that's actually an acorn worm, which has a pharynx like you and I have. Okay, and there's a lancelet, and then there's some of these fossil forms, these very early fish, which are extremely primitive. Right? It's a continuous sequence there. You couldn't ask for a nicer transition. Okay? Here's another one. The creationists have beat on this for a long time, and of course they've been outflanked by lots of new fossils, thankfully. This is Ichthyostega, the most famous early specimen to be found that's sort of halfway between a fish and amphibian, sometimes nicknamed a fish-ibian. And even this thing is not clearly one or the other. I mean, it does have 4 limbs that are capable of walking on land, but it also had a fish-like tail. It also had gill slits and many other aspects of its head that are fish-like. And it also had what's called a lateral line system, which are sensing currents in the water, which no land animal has. So it's very fish-like, and yet it walks on land. But if that wasn't enough, that's one they, of course, attack all the time. We have many, many more fossils found. So there's Ichthyostega again. This is one that was found more recently called Acanthostega, which is still more fish-like than Ichthyostega, and yet it does have 4 limbs, but the analysis of it shows it could never have walked on land very much. Okay, so if you've ever watched a salamander or a newt, they don't spend much time on land. They use their limbs to walk underwater most of the time. Okay, there's Acanthostega as it's reconstructed. And then my good friend and classmate and co-author Neil Shubin near Chicago found this fossil about 10 years ago called Tiktaalik, which is even more fish-like still than Acanthostega. So this thing has a head that's even more fish-like and limbs which are more primitive, but it's clearly an amphibian to even a creationist. And so here, for example, the sequence of limbs from Tiktaalik to some of these more advanced things and up to things which are amphibians. Again, there's no break there, right? They're a continuous sequence here. So, for example, this family tree here are things that everyone agrees are fish, and then a whole series of more and more advanced aquatic amphibians until you get to things everyone agrees are amphibians, like frogs, right? Where do you draw a line? There isn't any, right? It's a continuous sequence. And, of course, creationists won't admit these things exist. And they all say, oh, well, how could you ever imagine an amphibian or fish crawling out of land to become an amphibian? Actually, it's a very easy trick, because a whole other group of fishes, the bony fishes, which you and I know from aquariums and fish stores and going out and fishing in a lake, the majority of fish you know are bony fishes. They've done it many times in different groups, because growing on the land is a good trick, and a lot of them do it. In the southeast, the walking catfish is a problem. It doesn't walk really, it sort of wriggles across land, but it's a pest, because when it wants to, it can go from a lake canal to another one just by wriggling across the land and then move around, okay? There are things like mud skippers, for example, which are literally living half and half. They spend their time in tidal flats and mangrove swamps, and their eyes are adapted to seeing both above and below water at the same time. And that's how they live, literally on the borderline all the time. And there are many sculpins and other fish that live in tide pools that walk. Okay, they use their bony fins to walk, but they do, and they're good at surviving in the air for a significant amount of time. So fish have done this many, many times in different ways. It's not a big trick, actually. And then we get one new fossil after another. So most examples I'll talk about now were not around when I wrote the book 10 years ago, okay, and gave this lecture originally 10 years ago. So these are all new, which we'll show in the new edition of the book. This is what's often nicknamed the frogamander, Garabatragus hottenai. It has a body like a salamander, head like a frog. So which you call it? All right? It shows how both groups originated, okay? This, by the way, comes from the Permian of Texas, not far from here, actually. This is one of the earliest known amphibians, a thing called Hylonomus, and the most old one is Westlothiana, which is down here, nicknamed Lizzie the Lizard. It comes from Scotland. And it shows what the earliest land animals that laid eggs probably look like, okay? This one is one of my favorites. It was discovered about 7 or 8 years ago. This is Odonachilles hemitestacea, what I nicknamed the turtle on the half shell. And that's literally what it is. It's a turtle that has a shell on its belly, okay, a plastron, but no shell on its back. It still has ribs, okay? So it's half shelled and on one side and not on the other. And it's the last turtle in the entire history of life that still has teeth. If you look at any modern turtle, they have no teeth in their jaw, okay? And just recently they found a new turtle that's even more primitive than this, that shows a lot more features like that, and there's been several others discovered since Odonachilles was found. So there's a continuous sequence of these turtle-like forms going through time now. And so we go from reptiles that no one would call a turtle to things every creationist would admit is a turtle. Okay? Or how about snakes? There's something that really fits the biblical motif. Okay? All sorts of things associated with snakes, which I won't go into here, but we know snakes come from animals that had 4 legs, because every once in a while you have things like boids. Boa constrictors actually have hip and thigh bones. You don't see them because they're inside, but they still have the remnants of them. And these are snakes from the Cretaceous. This one is from the Cretaceous of Israel, which still has its hind limbs, which are shown in that detail right there. And then they just described a few weeks ago, before I gave this talk, this snake, which has 4 limbs. Okay, it's got tiny little vestigial front limbs and hind limbs here, because the reconstruction will look like. So there it is there with its limbs that did nothing whatsoever except hang around. So they're in the process of getting lost. Okay? Now, when I did this debate against Duane Gish in 1983, of course, he doesn't spend any time on any of this stuff, right? His audience doesn't care. What he really spends his time on is dinosaurs, because most creators want to own dinosaurs because they know they're popular, right? And so there's lots of examples of dinosaurs in every creationist lecture attempting to discredit evolution, all of which shows they know nothing about dinosaurs when they do this. The family tree of dinosaurs is beautifully documented in lots of ways. At the meetings I'm attending right now, the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology here in Dallas, every talk is on one more piece of that puzzle that's being discovered all the time. I'll just show you a couple of examples. I remember when I debated Duane Gish, he showed Triceratops and no other fossils, and say, oh, it all appears by itself, no transitional forms. Well, first of all, Triceratops right there is only one of many hundreds of different kinds of ceratopsian dinosaurs, which have these big bony frills and sometimes horns on their faces and so on. And we have an excellent fossil record of how they go back to something which has the frill but no horns, something every kid knows is Protoceratops, to back to things called Psittacosaurus, which still walked on 2 legs and not 4, but had the Triceratops-like head and beak and a beginning of a frill, and back to things like more primitive things like that. Okay? Or how about the big sauropods? Everybody loves Brontosaurus, which is not a valid name, but all these other things as well. We have excellent fossils that show primitive sauropods that still walked on 2 legs from the Triassic of Germany and from Arizona and a bunch of places. Okay? This is one, of course, that's been an icon of evolution ever since it was found in 1861, 2 years after Darwin's book came out. Archaeopteryx, the first fossil bird. And when people first, the creationists first try to deal with this, they say, oh, well, it's just a bird because it has feathers. And they ignore every other aspect of its anatomy. Okay? And if you look closely at that specimen, it's very much not like any bird you know. Okay? It has long, bony fingers. Know how many birds you know have long, bony fingers today? None, right? When you have chicken wings, that little portion of the bone that's all pointy that you never eat because there's no meat on it, that's their entire hand fused together. Okay? And if you've ever had chicken thighs, right, the very back of the chicken has no tail bones left anymore because they're fused together and then the tail bone is held by feathers. But this guy has a long dinosaurian tail and a dinosaurian ankle and teeth, which no living bird has. Okay? So if you didn't have the feathers when it was first discovered, in fact, one of these specimens which had very faint feathers was mistaken for the dinosaur Consternethus, which is the star of Jurassic Park. Okay? And so without the feathers, this thing is more dinosaur than bird. And only because of feathers, creationists have to fit it in their narrow category. It's got to be a bird because it has feathers. Okay, that's the way they think. But you look closer, it's very clearly a dinosaur which feathers early on. This is the wrist area of Archaeopteryx. This is a bone that they have in their wrist, which is shaped like a half moon. And it's a bone that causes them to be able to do this with their hand, which is the flight stroke. When the arm goes to the bottom of the flight stroke, the wrist does a snap, and that's where the feathers go in the full string. And if you ever watched Jurassic Park, where the dinosaur is called Velociraptor, although it's technically Deinonychus, if you watch how their hands move, that's the same grabbing motion they all have, because the closest relative to birds among the dinosaurs you know would be a Velociraptor. They're very, very close to birds. In fact, when Jurassic Park 4 came out, we were all disappointed because they didn't put feathers on them, which we know they had. Okay? So there's that distinctive wrist sequence that all birds have and almost all the predatory dinosaurs have. Okay? And in their ankles, they have a very distinctive thing where their ankle bones, instead of having their ankle hinge as you do between your shin bone and your first row of ankle bones, their hinge is between the first and second row of ankle bones. Okay? A feature only found in that group of dinosaurs and in birds. Okay? And you know this because the next time you have drumsticks, at KFC or a turkey dinner, okay, that little cap of bone on the end of the drumstick, usually cartilage, that's the first row of ankle bones, which no longer has any function. It's actually just resorbed into the tip of their shin bone. So as you eat your drumstick at Thanksgiving, praise the dinosaur that gave you. And then, of course, since Archaeopteryx, especially in recent years, the number of new specimens that have come out, mostly out of China most recently, although some other parts of the world as well, these are all dinosaurs by everyone's description of a dinosaur. None of these things can fly. None of these things are really birds yet, and they all have beautiful, beautiful feathers. Feathers evolved long, long before flight occurred. Okay? And you say, well, how can that be? But you remember, most of the feathers on a bird are not for flight, right? Most of the feathers on a bird are for insulation. Just like our hair is our insulation, right? The down feathers, right, are there for that purpose. And almost all these dinosaurs had down feathers, and some a little longer feathers, but none of them flew. None of them had flight feathers, okay? And now it turns out it looks like nearly all dinosaurs had feathers. Or at least they had juveniles, they probably did. If something as big as T-Rex might have lost them as an adult. And again, that's one of the reasons Jurassic Park 4 was a disappointment, because science had moved on, but the movies didn't. All right. So here is now a more up-to-date family tree of birds than I had in the original book. And there's just many, many different kinds all through the latter part of the age of dinosaurs, and all of them one step more advanced than the last one. This is Cynornis from China, for example. It still has a toothed beak, but does not have the long bony dinosaurian tail, and still has long fingers. Okay? And there's others which have lost the fingers and begin to fuse the hand together, but still have teeth left, so that you lose these features one at a time. All right, here's a group now closer to us. This is the transition from things that are not us, they're not mammals, to mammals. This group used to be called mammal-like reptiles. That term is no longer in use anymore. We call them synapsids. But they are one of the most beautifully documented sequence of fossils in the fossil record, because we have an amazing number of these things, which the most primitive ones are clearly reptilian in most respects, yet they're on our lineage. And then you go all the way to things that everyone agrees are a mammal by the time you get to the end of it. This shows you just a family tree of how many different kinds there were back in the Permian, which we have a lot of here in northwest Texas especially. And the things like the big finback thing that you see in all the dinosaur toy kits, which is actually not a dinosaur, it's one of our relatives, is one of those very primitive things. And then there's a big radiation of these things in the end Permian, some of the biggest hippos. Then most of them died out at a great mass extinction 250 million years ago, and then they radiated again. And by the end of the Triassic, as dinosaurs were taking over the planet, they all died off except for the mammals. Okay? And lots of cool things going on. For example, you look at these very primitive ones like the big finbacks that you get from Texas here, and they have all these bones in the back part of their jaw, okay, as all reptiles do actually. And when they start to evolve, the bone that becomes the dominant part of the jaw is this bone called the dentary. This is the only bone you have in your jaw right now, the one that holds teeth. And all these bones behind the dentary get less and less important because they're chewing more complex motions, and they have to reduce those bones in the back because they aren't part of the chewing motion anymore, and they're actually weaken the jaw. So those bones get reduced and reduced and gradually lost until all those bones are lost except for two, which you still have, by the way. One bone from the lower jaw called the articular, and a bone that hinges for that reptilian lower jaw to your skull called the quadrate. Okay? So all reptiles and these guys still had that jaw hinge. But mammals have a different hinge. Your jaw hinge is made of this bone, the dentary, which is up against a different bone in the skull called the squamosal. Okay? And so it's a very amazing transition. You literally go from one to the other. And when creationists talk about this, they say, oh, how can you imagine that happening? It happened to you when you were an embryo. Your jaw bones are in your ear now, and they were in your jaw when you started developing. Okay? You're hearing them at this very moment. They're known as the hammer and the anvil. Okay? The incus and the malleus. All right? Those two bones are making the vibrations on your eardrum that you're listening with right now. And they were in your jaw when you were an embryo. Okay? And they move in that process. And there's actually fossils like this one called Diarthrognathes, which has the mammal jaw joint in operation side by side with the reptilian jaw joint. So it's switch hitter, can do both. Okay? Literally in the process of switching jaw joints while it was alive. So all these things get progressively more and more mammal-like. So by the time you get to late Triassic, some of these things are so mammal-like. There's always been an argument among my colleagues, where do you start calling something a mammal? Right? There isn't any obvious break there in that sequence. How do you decide when it's a mammal, when it isn't? That's not an easy issue to resolve because we have so many good fossils that are getting more and more mammal-like. And then let's focus on mammals, which we are, and which I focus on myself. That's my area of research mostly. At the end of the age of dinosaurs and the early part of the age of mammals, in this yellow band right here, we had a gigantic radiation of nearly all the groups of mammals we have alive today. They radiated in a tremendous fashion at that point. And I'm just going to take a few examples just to show you how many amazing transitions we have. I have another new book coming out that's different from the one that I just mentioned. It's called The Princeton Field Guide to Prehistoric Mammals, and it'll have all these things in it in detail. This, for example, is a family tree of all the carnivorous mammals, the cats, hyenas and their relatives, mongoose and so on in this branch. The dogs, the bears, the seals, sea lions, and walruses, and weasels, and so on are in the other branch. And one of those, for example, is this one right here. This is Noliarctos, which comes from not far from where I live in California. It's a bear-like creature that's on its way to becoming a seal. So it does have flippers, but they're very primitive flippers. It can walk with much better than any living seal. Its ear region and its skull still look like the bear ancestors of all the seals and the relatives. All right? Or those of you who are John Lennon fans, this is the earliest known walrus, Proneotherium, with almost no tusks. And then you move to Gomphotheria, which has upper and lower tusks. And then you go to more advanced ones like Balanictus, which has got long tusks, but not as long as the modern walrus. Okay? Again, nice sequence there. And this is ironic because all these specimens, by the way, are on display in the San Diego Natural History Museum, just a few miles away from the Institute of Creation Research. If they actually wanted to learn this stuff, it's right there in their own town. Or if you like cats, I'm sure there are cat lovers here, judging from Facebook, a lot of you. Okay? There are many branches of cats and things that are related to cats, and saber-tooths, many different kinds of saber-tooths, and false saber-tooths from a lineage that's not a cat lineage that did saber-tooth independently. We have an amazing fossil record of them. Or the rest of you who are dog lovers, incredible fossil record of fossil dogs, including things that if you saw it today, you'd say it's a weasel until you look close enough at the anatomy and you realize it's a very primitive dog. So that's what they started out looking like. My particular specialty, however, is large hoof mammals. That's what I've worked on most of my career: horses, rhinos, tapirs, giraffes, antelopes, camels, and peccaries are my current area. But I worked on rhinos for 25 years. This is the family tree of the rhinos, horses, and tapirs and their relatives, plus a bunch of extinct groups. The rhinos, for example, most people don't know this, but we have only 5 species alive today, some of which are down to a handful of animals in the wild left. And they have 24-hour guards protecting them now because they're so heavily poached. They have an amazing sequence, mostly in North America, but then jumping back and forth to Eurasia quite frequently over the entire last 50 million years, including spectacular animals like this creature right here, which is Paraceratherium, which I wrote a book about 3 years ago. This guy is bigger than an elephant. There's an elephant there for scale. Towers way above most elephants and is bigger than any large mammoth or other large elephant relative we ever know about. And it's evolved from a very small creature about the size of a Great Dane down here. And yet, even though it's gigantic, it has the long, slender limbs of that running rhino that's its ancestor of. So this is one that's really spectacular. And that's a rhino, by the way, without horns. Most did not have horns. It's something quite revealing. When I started my undergraduate studies in paleontology, one of the projects I was assigned was to look at all these early Eocene mammal teeth that come from a place called Emblem, Wyoming, in the Bighorn Basin. And I was given a big box of unsorted fossils to sort through. And one of the most difficult things to tell apart was the earliest horses from the earliest tapirs from the earliest rhinos. There was a very, very subtle difference in the teeth, and you had to tune your eye to spot it. So here, for example, the earliest horse skull, the earliest tapir skull, and the earliest rhino skull. Okay, you barely tell them apart at that point unless you know what you're looking for. And these are the teeth I'm talking about here. Here's the earliest horse, here's the earliest tapir. There's subtle differences there, and there's the earliest rhino. Okay, until you get your eyes tuned. And now anybody can tell a horse from a rhino from a tapir, right? But back in the Eocene, you would never have been able to tell them apart. That's how much evolution has occurred. All right? This is one of the old favorites. It goes back to Lamarck in 1809, how the neck of a giraffe evolved. And there's various ridiculous caricatures of this out there. Lamarck, for example, arguing that they stretch their neck generation after generation, which we know now genetically doesn't work. Natural selection, of course, just selects for whichever happens to have the longest necks. It's the right way to answer that. But they say, oh, well, where are those half-neck giraffes? Well, yes, we have those too. By the way, giraffes have an immense fossil record, nearly all of which are short-necked creatures, more like the okapi, which is the other live species giraffe today. And most of them do not have short, long necks, but they do have bizarre, all sorts of weird horn combinations and so on. This is the modern okapi neck. This is the modern giraffe neck. And just last week, my good friend Nico Salunius described this neck, which is slightly longer than an okapi and not quite as long as a giraffe. So we now have an animal with a neck halfway there. Or if you like elephants and mastodons and mammoths, who doesn't, right? They have an amazing evolutionary story from these very pig-like things that go back about 50 million years ago. And there's the most primitive relative to elephants here, which if you looked at them, you say, oh, that's a pig, that's a hippo, to look close enough and see it's really an elephant, even though its tusks are short. And then they go through a whole spectrum of different kinds of mastodons, and then to the biggest mastodons, and then finally to mammoths and elephants, right? All the steps you would ever want to get yourself from one stage to the other, okay? Or how about manatees, right? Manatees, everybody loves those in Florida especially, right? They swim around, they're very peaceful, they love eating seaweeds and things like that. Manatees today, of course, only have 2 front flippers, but here's a manatee with 4 walking legs. Its skull and its teeth are strictly manatee. It's even got the heavy-duty ribs they use to float, and yet it's got 4 walking teeth. It's the walking, swimming manatee, okay? One of the best evolutionary sequences, of course, is one the creationists have been really left in the dust on, is this evolutionary sequence of whales. For the longest time, we didn't know much all about this, and then starting in the early 90s, we started finding more and more of these fossil whales that show this transition. And when the creationists say, oh, well, whales are supposedly related to even-toed hoof mammals like cows, so it's bossy to blowhole, and they use some weird little cartoon like this. No, we did not say cow, we said even-toed hoof mammals, and it turns out, based on molecular data and now on fossils, they're actually more closely related to hippos, which is not as big a surprise. But even better, we have all the fossils show how it took place. So this is the earliest relatives of both hippos and some other group called Anthracotherids, which are now extinct. They're halfway between the whale lineage and the hippo lineage, which they look like neither one, of course, because they're not yet part of those lineages. And then working your way up through things like Ambulocetus here and all the way up to things even a creationist would admit as a whale. All right, and I'll show you a few of these. This is Pachycetus, which is this one right here, which had 4 walking limbs, but already had a whale's-like head and whale-like ears, but it was found in beds that show it was mostly on land much of the time. And then this next one here is Ambulocetus. This is it right here, which was discovered in the mid-90s. Ambulocetus natans literally means the walking, swimming whale, because it's halfway between the two. It's got long, long toes and fingers and well-developed limbs, which probably had web feet like an otter. Probably swam like an otter too, but the head is much more like a whale with a big long skull with a huge whale-like vertebrae. And this thing's, the thing's about 10, 15 feet long, a big specimen. And it's known from a nearly complete skeleton, so it's not a fantasy. All right? And then you get to things like Dalanistes, which still has the long fingers and toes, but already is getting a whale-like body. And then they start to lose their limbs, but they still have them vestigially sticking out. So that's Rhodocetus, which is now starting to really look like a whale, but yet it still has limbs that could walk. All right? And then Basilosaurids, which have been known since the 1840s, these guys are big. These are about 50 feet long. But only in the last 15 years or so, we have found complete skeletons with the hind limbs are still preserved. That's its hind limb on a 50-foot whale. It's about the length of my arm. Right? Didn't have any function anymore. It's a tiny vestige hanging on this thing, which has just about lost its hind limbs. And the next time you go to a Natural History Museum, which has a big whale skeleton hanging over the ceiling, if they did their job right behind the rib cage, look carefully, and you should see a couple of tiny bones hanging there. That's all that's left of their hip and their thigh bone. It's deeply buried inside their skeleton, has no use whatsoever. It's just a relic of their evolutionary past. It tells you whales once walked on land. Okay? It's a silent witness to their evolutionary past and with no function whatsoever. Classic vestigial organ. Of course, none of this matters to creationists. I can talk myself blue in the face about this stuff and never get anywhere because they only really care about one species, right? We all know who that is, right? And they're always reacting very strongly. I mean, they'll even concede evolution in almost everything else. And the polls show that if you talk about evolution of any other animal, most people will accept it. But they aren't so comfortable accepting evolution of humans. And yet, if you're going to take the pill, you got to take it all the way, right? This is just as well supported as every one of those things. If it weren't for the fact as humans, we would have no problem with it at all. Okay? We are the ape's reflection. We are very much a part of the primate and the ape family grouping. Okay? And of course, everywhere you talk about this, it's not a very heavily emotional issue. It's a very strong view to a culture that we're somehow different. It also has all these false notions running out there, like missing link, which I told you is an outdated notion that officially became invalid in 1859, and no giant modern scientists ever use those terms. Sadly, reporters still do. We have thousands of intermediate forms that could be called missing links. But what you often have then is creationists doing things and think, well, you show them one hominid fossil and show them another, and you show them an ape, and say, what about all the ones in between? Right? They won't ever concede that you've got more than enough evidence to show what's going on here. Well, let me just show you. Okay, here's the game they're playing here. You have the word nearly spelled out there, and he said that can't possibly mean evolution. There are too many letters missing. It could actually mean creation. Or here, if you can read this, don't give me that something about missing transitional forms in the evolutionary tree. Okay, you don't need every piece of the puzzle to see the answer. All right, as you guys can tell. All right, so if you want to play that game of how many fossils do you need to establish that humans evolved, we've had that actually since 1924. This man right here, who lived to his hundreds, Raymond Dart in South Africa, is the founder of this specimen, the famous tongue baby, Australopithecus africanus, the first fossil that was clearly not a member of our genus Homo, yet it was hominin, it related to us. Okay, and that's 1924. Okay, it's only a little over 90 years now since that fossil has been found. Okay, and so if that was all you needed, just one specimen, we'd have it right there. We've had it for more than 90 years. But, of course, we have many more than one specimen. This is the famous picture shown of Tim White there and Don Johanson when they described Lucy. There's Lucy right there and all the other specimens in their collection about them. Thousands and thousands of hominid fossils have been found now. The vaults in the Kenya National Museum in Nairobi alone have tens of thousands of hominid fossils, okay, which is usually the biggest collection anywhere in the world. Okay? And most of them now represented by pretty good skull material, so if we were to decide this is an ape and where it's a human is hard to do because we have almost every skull, everything in between. I remember when I did an episode with a British crew that came over to talk about creationism, I did my job at the beginning of the video and argued about the Grand Canyon. But at the end, Tim White at Berkeley met with these British creationists. He brought him to his lab. He set 4 skulls on the table. He said, sort these out. And of course, they sorted them out from primitive to advanced. So that's exactly the order we find them in Ethiopia. They had proven evolution without intending to. Okay? And what you instead find is creationists play these mind games and word tricks and try to do anything they can to misdirect you and talk about minor things. So they'll cite outdated stuff, like Peking man, all specimens of lost. Well, the original specimens of Peking man, which is now just Homo erectus from Zhegudian caves in China, were lost because the Japanese were invading China that year, and the American and Chinese scientists were trying to smuggle the fossils out before the Japanese ran away with them. And so they got lost in the process, probably sunk before the ship ever left harbor. But we have many, many more specimens from those same caves that have been found since World War II. Creationists will never tell you that, okay? Or they'll say about Neanderthal man, well, it was based on a specimen of rickets. Well, the very first skeleton to be described was indeed a diseased individual. We have hundreds of healthy skeletons found since then. They never mention that, okay? They talk about things like Cro-Magnon as if it's just something different from Homo sapiens. No anthropologist thinks it is. They talk about some of these other ones here and pretend there's, Piltdown was an obvious forgery, but it wasn't creationists who figured this out. It was scientists who figured this out, and it was because they were seeing what they wanted to see in a specimen that was deliberately created to fit their biases, okay? One mistake doesn't make the entire fossil record invalid. Or they say Nebraska man was reconstructed from the jaw of a pig. And there's the original specimen. This is the man who did this, Henry Fairfax Osborn in 1922. And most of us who know paleontology know Osborn was not a very competent paleontologist, but he was very powerful. So he decided to publish on this really crummy little tooth here because he really, really wanted to believe it was hominin, or at least ape-like. And naturally, once he did, of course, the media, as they always do back in the 20s as they do now, went way overboard and created all these additional reconstructions which aren't based on anything at all. And then when, of course, a year or so later, all of his colleagues in the same museum said, Henry, this is just the tooth of a peccary, which, by the way, is not a pig. Peccaries, or javelinas, which live here in Texas, are a separate family. They've separated from pigs for 40 million years and not closely related. And yet our creationists say, oh, jaw of the pig, and then they get a laugh from their audience. It's not a pig in the first place. They don't even have their biology right. And it's a very poorly preserved, very worn tooth that's slightly rotated in the socket. So it was very, very tricky to interpret. It was something that most of us would not have touched because it is so poorly preserved, but Osborn was wishful thinking. I've tried this on them before. I'll show them teeth of a peccary and teeth of an ape side by side. They can't tell the difference. Pigs, peccaries, and humans all eat very similar things. We're omnivores, and so we have extremely similar teeth. Okay, so it's a very honest mistake to make with a little wishful thinking on his part. And this is really the way you want to think of human evolution anyway, right? It keeps getting branching and bushier all the time with many, many more fossils, practically 2 or 3 new species described a year in some years. Like this year, we've had several already. Okay, from the most primitive member of our lineage, which is this one here from almost 7 million years ago, Sahelanthropus chadensis, which is about chimp size, but it was fully upright as early as 6.5 million years ago, to famous Lucy skeleton, which is the first really complete skeleton of a hominin that we know of, although now Ardipithecus is almost as complete as that. To various, the heavy-duty things, the Paranthropus lineage. This is the black skull, which is the earliest Paranthropus, Paranthropus ethiopicus. This is the one that made Louis Leakey's and Mary Leakey's reputation, the Olduvai hominid, which is now known as Paranthropus boisei. Big, robust nutcracker man was their nickname for it, not a member of our direct lineage. This is the specimen that made Richard Leakey's reputation, Louis Leakey's son, which is one of the earliest members of our genus Homo. And then, of course, we've got better skeletons as we get younger. This is one of the earliest Homo erectus skeletons. It's 99% complete. It's not a modern human. It's some Homo erectus, okay? So all this fossil evidence is there, and yet you see that silly little cartoon I showed you there with distortions and misdirections and outright lies, and you get their completely wrong impression about what we know about the fossil record. But even if we had 0 hominid fossils, we would know that we're closely related to chimps and gorillas and the rest of the apes, because every single cell in your body is proof of that, okay? When you take a DNA from your hair or your fingernails or any tissue, like you see on CSI where they swab the cheeks, they can immediately sequence your DNA. And when you sequence your DNA, any way you do it, you come out to about 99 to 98% more identical to a chimp, and a little less than that for a gorilla, about 97, 98%, and about 97% to orangutan, and then less as you go further away, okay? In other words, you're genetically so similar to the other 2 species of chimp, the common chimp and the bonobo or the pygmy chimp, that my friend Jared Diamond once put it this way in the title of his book: if an alien came from another planet and all he had was samples of your DNA and DNA of other apes and other organisms, and just sequence your DNA, he would decide that you are a 3rd species of chimpanzee. That's how close you are genetically, okay? We're more closely related to those 2 chimpanzees than any other type of animal on the planet, or any other 2 animals are related to each other, okay? For example, we're 98 to 99% related to chimpanzees. We're closer to each other than, say, tigers and lions, which are only 95.5% related to one another, okay? In this little cartoon here where the ape and the human baby are doing exactly the same thing, so to remind you how similar we are. You know, we have a little bit less hair, although some humans are close, but we are very much ape-like in virtually every part of our anatomy, especially our DNA, okay? And this is a very interesting diagram. I just ran into this a couple of years ago. When you sequence the DNA and do genetic distancing, This is the entire human species here, this little tiny branching thing. All the so-called races of humans are very, very recently derived. In the last 100,000, 70,000 years, when all races of humans separated. Very, very recent event. And genetically, we're that little tiny branch, okay? By comparison, this is how different we are from Neanderthals, which we apparently did interbreed with early in our history. And here, for example, are the radiations of various types of populations of chimpanzees. The eastern chimpanzees, the Nigerian chimps, the western chimps. They're more genetically different than we are on the whole human race. So if you think chimps look alike, what do they think about us? Okay? So there's all the hominid fossils there. Evolution. We have the fossils. We win. Now, some of you are familiar with this, as I can tell from the laughter. You say a list, and this is my last of my slides on fossils, and it just goes right over the heads, okay? It doesn't matter how many times you show them this over and over again. It will simply not register, okay? And those of you who are laughing recognize this. This is a creationist inventor, Wendy Wright, with a very bizarre YouTube video. You just have to type Richard Dawkins, Wendy Wright, or Richard Dawkins creationist. It'll be the first hit you get. And it's almost excruciating to watch, because Richard Dawkins tries to very calmly and in his very proper British fashion just reason with this woman and say, well, what about these fossils? And what about those fossils? And we go to a museum, and she says, I've never seen any transitional fossils in a museum. You know, if you put them right in front of them, as I've done when I debate creationists, and put pictures of them on the slide, or even bring specimens, they will refuse to see what's right in front of them. Okay? Because it's not about evidence. It never was about evidence. It's never about facts. It's all about something else, and that's what we're going to talk about now. It's really about the way the human mind works. Okay? We are all prisoners of this. We don't like to think so, but we are. Humans hold many different ideas in their head at the same time, some of which conflict with each other, and we live with it. Okay? We have to live with it. Okay? The psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. Certain ideas are deeply part of our psyche. Certain ideas are deeply part of what we believe about ourselves. And every time we run into something in the world that does not fit that worldview, we either ignore it or reject it, or we put it in a completely different compartment of the brain and don't let it influence how we think. Okay? And we do this in lots of ways. We're all products of this. We don't think rationally, we think emotionally. Humans are emotional creatures, not rational creatures, in spite of what you think here. So this is the way that cognitive dissonance works, right? The scientific facts of the world contradict a literal interpretation of the Bible, but they, of course, have to believe, that, at least some of them, that the Bible must be literally true. Therefore, something must be wrong with the facts, right? You don't accept facts first, they accept that the Bible is right, okay? It's really all about emotional arguments, right? It's about, they cannot get this idea across that we might not just be separately created, that we really do have good relatives over there in the zoo. All right? Or this one, I love this. Who said that? What? I can't hear you. Protect your creationist beliefs in style with these God-approved eye and ear guards. Blocks out 90% of all known science. And that's basically what it is. It's putting your fingers in your ears and making noises so you don't hear it. Okay? Or this one here. Unfortunately, this is how the brain works. Sir, receiving information that conflicts with our belief system. Get rid of it. We all do this, but sometimes some would do it more than others. Okay? The other element that's a big problem here is not just cognitive dissonance, but what you can call, in the anthropological sense, tribalism. We're all parts of tribes, right? We all belong to organizations like the group that's meeting here tonight, okay? We learn our worldview and the way we accept the world from the people who are raised by and the people who are part of our community. And most of you in this audience know it's very hard to break from the way you were raised. And many of you probably had significant battles with family over this. To be the black sheep and go against your family and your peers is very difficult. Right? It's very tough to pull away from that if you find the evidence no longer allows you to do that. And so a lot of it is just about comfort, acceptance, becoming part of a community, and anything that threatens you're part of that community, you have to reject. Okay? And if you know the people who are in this argument, well, most often, it's not an argument of science for them at all. Right? It's that the world is black and white. It's very Manichaean. Right? If anything threatens that pure vision of the world they have, then it's got to be sinful. Right? Dogma is all about soul, salvation, torture, and hell. This is really what motivates them. So in reality, no matter how much evidence you brought to bear, none of it would make a difference, because they're not really interested in evidence. They're interested in redemption. Right? They're interested in not going to hell is really what they're scared of. So we have this very strange society where we are now at the cutting edge of science. We all have devices like I'm holding in my hand right now that would not be here without science, and yet we still have primitive Bronze Age notions which rule half of what we do, okay? So this woman here is saying, so let me get this straight. You're using a computer on the internet, you watch TV, you have a smartphone, You take medicine when you're sick. You fly in airplanes. You drive in cars. Not a long list of scientific things here. But you think scientists are lying about evolution. That is the really jarring thing about this whole thing, is that they only accept the science they want to accept. And that's really not the way it's played, right? The science tells you what it is. You can accept it or not accept it. Okay? Or like my good friend Bill Nye says, the natural world is a package deal. You don't get to select which facts you like and which facts you don't. Right? It's just simply the way it is. It's not a chance to cherry pick what you like. Okay? Or as Neil deGrasse Tyson said, when different experiments give you the same result, it's no longer subject to your opinion. Okay? That's the good thing about science. It's true whether or not you believe in it. That's why it works. So this is what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with society, in practically the only society left in the Western industrialized world that's still got religion getting in the way of its policy. Okay? Where scientific truth is being held back by all sorts of science deniers, not just creationists, but anti-vaxxers and climate deniers. They all follow the same exact strategies. Okay? So let's wrap this up now. Why should we care about this, right? I mean, Texas probably don't have to make this argument. Some parts of the country, it's not a problem, okay? And in California, I almost never deal with it anymore, okay? Why should it matter that we are forced to accept what science tells us, that evolution is part of our life, and that it's not just, leave them alone, they'll do their thing and I'll do mine. There are actual consequences to the way creationists have affected American society. Well, let's step first back and look at the first thing, which is evolution happens whether you like it or not. It's happening all the time, at every level, okay? There's a famous article in Scientific American came out a few years ago, shows evolution of all sorts, from geckos to peppered moths, all sorts of scales of evolution, okay? It's happening in real time. We watch it all the time. There's a huge community of evolutionary biologists whose whole job is to go out in very dangerous swamps and all over uncomfortable parts of the world just to watch evolution happen, okay? Not even just that. It's probably happening in a bunch of your bodies right now. Viruses and bacteria, right? Their job is to find a way to reproduce themselves, which is how they do it, is by infecting you, okay? And especially viruses shown here, what they do is they put on a different coat, a protein coat each time, so that's why there's always a new flu strain every year, which you've hopefully got your flu shot by now, okay? Because that new coat tricks your immune system, and that's how they infect you, until your body recognizes that new coat, and then it fights it back. And that's how they're successful at always infecting us year-round, okay? And that's why there never will be a cure for the common cold. The cold virus evolves too fast for anything to stop it, okay? There are examples of where it's actually deadly. It's not just a casual religious belief that we can all ignore. The example I talked about in my book, and still a famous one, is a surgeon by the name of Dr. Leonard Bailey at Loma Linda University in Southern California. And he had this experimental surgery where he had a baby with a defective heart they called baby Faye, and did a heart transplant of a small heart that would fit it, which used a baby chimp, or used a baby baboon rather than a baby chimp. And as you might guess, baby rejected the heart and died. And nobody seemed to think about what was the problem there until an Australian film crew asked him after the whole thing was done, well, why didn't you use a chimpanzee instead of a baboon? And Bailey said, because I don't believe in evolution. Oh. So that baby was basically a victim of creationism in every sense of the word, okay? And Bailey, by the way, was at Loma Linda, which is Seventh-day Adventist, which is a virulently creationist organization. And nothing ever happened. He was never sued for malpractice, which would have been if he'd been in a regular hospital. And he went on and retired without any problems. Okay? Yet that baby died because of creationism. But it's broader than that. Okay? It's the grand unifying theme of biology. Every part of biology is linked through evolution. It's a common thread that makes everything work. From genetics to embryology to systematics to biogeography to behavior, nothing of them makes sense without them. And as the great geneticist Theodosius Drobjansky said it, nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. That's why the best biology textbooks in high school level have evolution at the beginning and tie it into every theme that they cover. Okay? Even in places like the Bible Belt here in Texas and in the South, evolution's happening whether you like it or not. This is a quote that I put in my book here where the very strange thing, the people who are most creationists are often the farmers who are watching evolution in action, because the pests that they're spraying for all the time, the insects that resolve resistance to DDT and every other pesticide, are evolving faster than we can make chemicals to kill them. So evolution's happening, and they refuse to believe in it, and yet they're spraying their fields. Okay? All right, but it's broader than that. Evolution is just the tip of the iceberg. This is what public least understands and often the most queasy about. Therefore, that's a creationist attack. But you read what they write, they've made no secret of the fact that everything in science will be rearranged as they get their way, okay? They want to attack not just evolution, but of course geology replaced with flood geology, which I've talked about in other lectures. They've talked about replacing astronomy with Genesis, and of course paleoanthropology, forget that. None of that is there, just Adam and Eve, okay? So this little cartoon says it very nicely here. Teach both theories, let the kids decide. Yeah, right. Like we're going to decide between chemistry and alchemy, right? Or between phrenology, reading bumps on the head, and modern neurology, or between magic and physics, or between astrology and astronomy. By the way, a lot of Americans don't know there's a difference between the two. You know, lots of ideas out there have already been debunked, right? We don't teach the flat earth anymore. We don't teach magic. We don't teach phrenology. We don't teach any of these ideas for a reason. We know they're false. And the same is true of creationism. It does not have a status in science that deserves to be taught in public schools. I mean, if you really take the Bible literally, like many of these people do, you've got to accept not only that the Noah's Ark story is literal, which is ludicrous already, but that the earth is flat. The Bible very clearly says that. The earth does not move. The earth rests on pillars, that the sun goes around the earth. The stars are set in the lights set in the domes of the earth. So this is the big problem we have. There's not such a thing as creation science and real science. There's science and non-science, okay? You're not allowed to teach in a school that something's not scientific. And so here we have our teacher saying, I'm sorry, Billy, but 6 times 8 is not 112. You need to show your work. I believe the answer is 112. I have faith that my answer is right and yours is wrong. I don't need to show my work. How dare you question my faith? Okay? And at the bottom it says, once creation was allowed in schools, this is bound to happen eventually, right? 2 plus 2 does not equal 5. Okay, but there are statements by creationists saying, if God told me 2 plus 2 equals 5, I would believe it. Right? That's exactly the kind of thinking we're talking about here. So, there is no controversy, right? We are not fighting over the flat earth anymore. We're not sitting in the center of the solar system. The sun is. And there is no such thing as the creation story. That's just a myth from the Bronze Age. And there's practical implications in all sorts of directions. Okay? As a person who's been in geology all my career, and I've been in oil geology and know a lot of oil geologists, and here in Texas you probably do too, okay? There's no possibility you could ever use flood geology if you wanted to actually have oil or coal, right? And there are no creationists who actually use creationism to find oil. They have to be real geologists who reject the Noah's flood story. If they weren't, we would be in big problems, because oil is found by using real geology, not flood geology, okay? There's another aspect to this as well, especially here in the United States. What's really done is that creationists have diffused and sort of really ruined a lot of our American science education, especially in parts of the country where they're very powerful. So science teachers, even if they want to teach real science and talk about evolution, are often afraid to do so. Okay? And they cannot say what they want to say because they know they're going to get a lot of garbage from their parents. The result is that many of our students come out way behind every other Western industrialized nation, because we get a giant gap in our education when it comes to any aspect of science that conflicts with religion. We're routinely ranked near the bottom of all the Western industrialized nations, and usually the top countries are Japan, China, Netherlands, Iceland, Canada, Sweden, Switzerland, Germany, always in some order like that in the top 10. And you do these polls, high percentage of America still thinks that the earth, the sun revolves around the earth. They think dinosaurs lived with humans like the Flintstones was history. Can't tell the difference between pseudoscience and science. There's a startling and sad truth about ourselves, okay? And so these are various diagrams I will show. Here are dead last in science literacy, next to Cyprus and Turkey and Lithuania. Not to insult anyone from Cyprus or Turkey, but they don't spend nearly like we do on education, all right? This is the acceptance of evolution across the westernized world. And there's Western and Northern European countries here. Acceptance of evolution is in blue, creationism in red. There's the U.S. down here with Turkey and Cyprus and a few other very poor countries, okay? All right? Or here's a very interesting graph. This is economic wealth, the gross domestic product per capita, versus acceptance of various questions that have to do with evolution, okay? And it's a little hard to read here, but these are all Western European nations up here at the top, and then Eastern European nations, which have lost a bit of time during the Soviet Union days when they didn't learn as much, and Southern European nations. And there is a couple other nations like Norway, which is very wealthy. There's the U.S. Okay? We're like the third world country when it comes to science education, even though we are one of the wealthiest in the world. Okay? Creationism is on the march in lots of places. These are showing schools where tax-funded creationism is going on. There's Tennessee, there's Louisiana, there's quite a few in Texas going on still. Private schools where they manage to get public funds to teach what essentially is a narrow religious dogma. However, it's not as bad as some people think. You read these polls, Gallup polls especially, over and over again. 40, 45, 46% of Americans are creationists. But the Gallup poll is one of the worst worded polls of any poll that's ever been done. It gives you only 3 choices, 2 of which are religious, and the only one that's scientific does not have religion in it. So it naturally stacks the entire question, so it forces people into religious answers. Anyone who is the least religious is pretty much forced to accept that. If you actually break it down by actual beliefs in various things, the number of people who actually believe the Earth is only 6,000 or 10,000 years old or believe in flood geology is much, much smaller, okay? So for example, acceptance of plate tectonics is very high here. Acceptance of human evolution, 40 or 50% of Americans accept that, which is not good, but it's better than you think it is, okay? Even acceptance of evolution of anything but humans is quite high. All right, so there's a lot of difference there. So for example, here we go. 53% of Americans agree that plants and animals evolved. They just don't want humans. Right? That's an interesting line they draw. Only 18% of Americans believe young Earth creationism in the sense that the young Earthers do. Okay, it's not as widespread as you think it is. Okay, although in Texas you wouldn't know. 80% agree that continents have moved over millions of years. Okay, one poll even found that 46% of people even agree with human evolution. So watch out for polls. Wording is crucial. And polls are often misleading because of the way they're worded. Okay, and Gallup is the worst. Okay, so now I've thoroughly depressed you, and you're probably just as depressed as I am. I've battled this stuff for nearly 40 years of my life, and it never seems to change. But actually, there are signs of hope. The world is changing, and not in the way that creationists would like. Okay, the battles in the U.S. don't seem to change very much, but what's happening is that, interestingly enough, the last 20 years, and especially the last 10 years, when the right-wingers have had the political power to do what they always wanted to do, which is mess around with science education and ban abortion and all the other things that they promised they could do when they had the power, what they ended up doing was driving the entire younger generation away, not just from fundamentalism, but from religion as a whole. So if you look at the polling numbers now, young Americans, especially young Americans in the millennial generation, not only are the least religious generation of Americans in history, but as they age, they don't get more religious. They stay non-religious, okay? And this is a very, very interesting statistic right here. And it's basically what's happened across the world, any place that industrialization and modernization has occurred. You go to Europe now, there's no such thing as a creationism problem. In fact, most European churches are empty, and they're turned into bars and public meeting houses because religion has just about died in most of Northern and Western Europe. Okay? Even Canada. Canada's not that different from us in most ways, but they have no trouble with creationism. There's no significant creationist movement there, and they're mostly a secular nation. Okay? We're the last one on the planet that still has this problem, all right? And it's interesting what things to explain it. Usually it's a system where they have the dreaded socialism. They have a good social support net, you know, from cradle to grave security and good vacations and good health care, and all these things are part of their pact with their government, and they stop being religious. You don't need to pray so much when the state is taking care of you, okay? And if your survival is not at stake, religion tends to disappear. All the people who don't want to hear that, but that in fact is what's happened. All right, so these are some polls that showed the least religious generation in many, many centuries is the young millennials, and as they age, they stay something in the order of 30 to 40% non-religious. The largest group in the country after Catholics is the nuns, people who have no formal religious belief. You guys in this room are actually an emerging majority, okay? And you're growing. Even the fundamentalists are declining in numbers right now, and they're not recruiting among the young at all because the young are polarized against them after watching them get political power. All right, so here are a number of statistics that show these types of things here, a percentage of various, so there's a millennial, something in the order of 26 to 29% non-religious, and that number just stays through no matter what other generation. The boomers are not far behind. The change is amazing. You know, people who are raised Roman Catholic declined 22% in about a decade. The various types of Protestants have been declining, and the nuns are the unaffiliated who jumped the most. Okay, and so there's more things. The number of godless people is growing dramatically. It's at least 20%, depending on how you define it, maybe 30%. People who believe the Bible literally has dropped dramatically. That's that red circle there. The literalist interpretation is vanishing. Not because we did a better job of science education, ironically, but because they got power to do what they wanted, and they scared the whole younger generation away from religion. And so all these other groups of non-religious are now increasing. Okay? Yeah, and that also says it a lot. I grew up in a generation where the only way I could find out that I was not the only person on the planet who didn't accept what my parents, I was raised Presbyterian, believed was to do a lot of reading in library books. And now most of the people in this room probably found what they wanted to find on the internet, right? They're no longer insulated by your little church community where you walk around town, they ask you, what church do you belong to? Okay? You can now find a community, a virtual community, start now a real community of people who think like you. So religions go to die thanks to the internet. You can't keep the cat in the bag anymore. As Carl Sagan here says, it's a very beautiful quote here, "It is better to grasp the universe as it really is than to persist in delusion, however comforting, however satisfying and reassuring." Or as Isaac Asimov, one of my personal heroes, said, "So the universe is not quite like you thought it was. You better rearrange your beliefs then, because you certainly can't rearrange the universe." Okay? So these are the choices we're faced with, right? We can do it like creationists do and play like hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, but we'll just be stuck with it we've been since the Middle Ages and not getting anywhere at all. Okay? And there are consequences to those choices. It says it very nicely here, right? We fall behind in science education. There's plenty of countries in the world that don't have creationism holding them back, right? Creationists found unlikely support among students in China and India. "Yes, America, we very much like if you would teach your children religious dogmas instead of science. We'd like your jobs." That really is an economic aspect to it too. Okay? So our future is stake, and especially my 3 sons here. There's Eric, Zachary, and Gabriel. This is the world. I hope they'll have a better one than I had and won't have to deal with creationists nearly as much. So these are the choices we face. You know, we can move forward like every other westernized nation in Europe and Asia has already done, or we can live in the Middle Ages for as long as this parts of the world want to. Okay, we can come to terms with the world as it is, in which Darwin led us, and Darwin said it best, the very last words of The Origin of Species. "There's grandeur in this view of life, with the several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms into one, that whilst this planet has gone on cycling according to fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." Thank you.